What is extropy? Science in motion. The things we thought were fixed are no longer fixed. Science is moving. Maybe you know the word entropy, which is a word from the physics realm describing the state of things. In fact, it has to do with energy and where are we heading. But the word extropy might mean nothing to you, but it does mean a lot to Max Moore, who is the editor of the magazine called Extropy. Max, what does that mean?
Well, Luke, extropy is not meant as a technical scientific term. It's really a kind of metaphor for all the forces that reduce entropy, anything that increases human intelligence, increases lifespan, overcomes the limits of human biology. So extropians are those people who are interested in using science, technology, and reason to extend our lifespans, to become hopefully, potentially, I wouldn't quite say immortal, but live as long as possible, to move off the planet, or to leave our biological bodies, or to replace the biological components with technology that will allow us to be smarter, stronger, more intelligent than we've ever been.
Now, something that some people have heard about it is called nanotechnology, which means making things very, very small and more effective. Is that part of what you call the extropian movement?
Nanotechnology is just one of the technologies we're interested in. Really, extropians are interested in certain ideas, certain tendencies of going beyond human limits, and any technology which helps that is important. Molecular nanotechnology is one of the most crucial technologies because essentially it means the ability to control matter at the atomic level, which really means eventually we'll be able to program physical reality rather like we do software. We'll be able to give instructions to these machines. They can build any device you want, reconfigure physical reality, not too differently from virtual reality. So in a way, the distinction between virtual and physical reality will be a little bit more fuzzy. Physical reality will be more configurable, just like virtual reality.
So, some of the items you cover in your magazine and in the lectures and seminars you give are about aging. Yeah, a good example of that is Tim Leary. He died, and around his death, he made a whole myth, a whole story. How do you see that?
The whole episode of Tim Leary, to me, was very disturbing, very distressing. Tim had been signed up for cryonic suspension for a number of years. He was one of the few people who could see far enough into the future to understand that being buried or cremated was not a very sensible thing anymore, that there are now methods of preserving the body at legal death, not the same as biological death, in the hopes that future technology could reverse the damage and bring you back to youthful life. Unfortunately, in the last month or two, I think under the influence of a number of people, John Perry Barlow for one, a number of reincarnationists around him, he apparently decided not to do that anymore, changed his mind at the very last moment, and ended up being cremated. So Tim is no longer with us. Perhaps one day we can reconstruct his personality in some way, but he's not going to be with us for quite a while.
He has certainly left a lot of writing and books and material behind.
Yeah, he has a lot of important work. I think, although Tim wasn't perhaps the most rigorous analytical thinker, he was a big inspiration to the extropian movement in a way. His formula, the SMILE formula, standing for space migration, intelligence increase, life extension, is almost a core part of extropian thinking. It really summarizes those ideas of overcoming human limits spatially, in terms of time, and in terms of intelligence, really the three core things.
What did happen was that the remains of Tim were shot into space, so he became Stardust again.
Yeah, unfortunately to me that's not really not much of an advance beyond being cremated and scattered at sea. It doesn't really get you into the future.
Okay. You mentioned John Perry Barlow. He was one of the people who founded the movement around protecting cyberspace, protecting the hackers. He wrote a cyberspace independence declaration. What is the view of the extropians about that?
Well, I wouldn't like to say what the view of the extropians in general is, because I can only really speak for myself. I'm sure there are a number of different views. But I know that some extropians are a little disturbed by what he wrote, in that he seemed to put a very strong separation between cyberspace and the physical world. He seemed to think that the normal rules don't apply in cyberspace, which I personally think is a dangerous idea. If he thinks that the government can't control anything in cyberspace, I think he's mistaken. They can certainly come around and take away your computer and throw you in jail, and you can't type on your machine anymore. So I think he didn't have a very realistic view of how independent cyberspace can be and didn't address some of the real issues. Plus, it seems like he's talking about some kind of universal system on the internet, whereas I think extropians are more likely to want what we call a polycentric system, where power centers are widely distributed. Rather than having one set of laws for all, no matter how good they are, we'd rather have more choice there, have different systems of rules. So I like his basic thrust for increasing freedom in cyberspace, keeping government the heck out of it, no taxing, no regulation, but some of the other ideas I'm not so sure about.
Well, one of his main themes these days is that copyright is undefendable and therefore should not be valid in cyberspace. On the other hand, what we see is that there was a big conference a while ago, WIPO, on intellectual property rights. They tried to bring databases as a copyrightable item. That didn't succeed, but what did succeed is to bring more of like music and song text into the cyberspace copyright domain. That means you have to pay for them. Do you see this will that this whole copyright issue will limit the expansion of cyberspace?
I don't think so. It's hard to say how it's going to play out right now. I think we're finding ways of using various kinds of encryption techniques so that, for instance, people producing photographic images or artwork can track whether that's being used by somebody. You can put a kind of a digital watermark on it. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of thing is important. I think intellectual property is as important as physical property. But we have to be very careful about it. There's also some very bizarre ideas of copyrighting human genes, for instance. To me, that's not acceptable because nothing is being created there. It's not an innovation. It's just a discovery of something that's already there. Could Newton, for instance, have copyrighted the laws of gravity? I don't think that would be reasonable. So the movement towards intellectual property has gone too far. But I think it is important to protect some of it. That'll actually give incentives for more creation of cyberspace. If you can actually make some money by creating ideas, there'll be more ideas created.
Yeah, but we see that the people who saw the cyberspace revolution, and people like, on one hand, Barlow and even Lundell, who saw the Silicon Brotherhood years and years ago. But on the other hand, there's Bill Gates, and he's buying copyrightable material and recopywriting art that he bought from all museums as his new domain.
Fortunately, though, it seems that Bill is not interested in keeping it as his private preserve. He's interested in making it available on CD-ROMs like the new Leonardo CD, which is really a brilliant piece of work where you can slide a virtual magnifying glass over it and translate the words instantaneously. And I think as long as it's owned by people who are going to make it widely available like that, rather than hiding it in their own little room.
Yeah, but you have to pay Microsoft for that.
Well, as long as that makes it more widely accessible, that might not be a bad thing. Just as you pay for a book, if you didn't pay for books, the words wouldn't get out there because you couldn't afford to distribute them. So it really depends on the infrastructure. I'm not too worried about Bill's buying up these images, as long as he makes money by making them more widely available in new forms that are more accessible than ever before. That may not be such a bad thing.
We're heading into a new millennium. What do you see as the main trends coming there? Is your extropian idea going to be part of it, or will you remain like a small minority interest?
I think extropian thinking is going to spread very fast. It already has spread. We only really founded the idea, the magazine started in 1988. And the ideas have spread through the internet incredibly quickly. We're naturally conducive to the internet. Ideas get spread across the whole planet. And now we've grown from just a handful of people to quite a few thousand. It's very hard to count the numbers. But I see larger parts of the more mainstream culture is starting to think our way. Wired magazine has done pretty well. They've grown to about 1/3 in circulation, and there's a lot of extropian thinking involved in some of their articles. So ideas that we used to push that were very extreme are now becoming a little more acceptable and mainstream. And I see what we'll be doing. Extropy Institute's interest really is in rethinking the human condition as we enter this new millennium, thinking about how can we really change the human body and the human brain. Do we really have to accept aging and death? Do we really have to accept limits to human intelligence? Do we really have to be stuck with this one planet? Do we really have limited resources? All these ideas we're challenging, and I think eventually these ideas will become very mainstream.
Mm-hmm. When you look back in history, who were your inspirators?
Oh, many people have inspired me. I guess from earliest on was Aristotle, back with the ancient Greeks, with his emphasis on reason, on human flourishing, on people maximizing their capabilities. So we're pushing that a step further by using technology. Back then, Aristotle didn't have technology to do that. He just used rational thinking. But now we can start to, for instance, have synthetic neurons. Researchers here at University of Southern California say that within 10 years, we can probably replace parts of the damaged brain with synthetic neurons. Once you can do that, you can augment the function. You could have a supercomputer built into your brain and think a lot more powerfully. So Aristotle from way back. I think more recently Friedrich Nietzsche is definitely an influence on me in that he really saw beyond the current human condition. He didn't believe in a god, so basically you're left with only human beings, so you better make the most of it. And Nietzsche foresaw that some of us will eventually become more than human, and he called those the Übermensch. We call them post-human, which is really something that more people can participate in, not quite as exclusive as Nietzsche's view perhaps. Mm-hmm. So Aristotle and Nietzsche, and more recently a lot of different futurists. Tim Leary, I mentioned earlier, he's quite important with his space migration intelligence increase.
The ideas of, say, Buckminster Fuller?
Not really Buckminster Fuller. I never really read him. I'm familiar with some of the things he did, but I've never really studied his work.
And the ideas about cyberspace from Bill Gibson, because your idea of changing the mind comes up in his books by plugging in and augmenting our capabilities.
Bill Gibson, not really. I think he didn't really originate some of these ideas as much as some people think. I think, for instance, that Werner Vinge... Oh, this is driving me nuts.
Oh, the cat.
Let the cat in.
I'll
pick up on the microphone.
No.
Lift that up.
This
I can't concentrate with it yowling.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, Werner Vinge. He was his book True Names was really the first book describing what later was attributed to Bill about living in a virtual world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Vinge didn't invent the term cyberspace. Gibson did invent that term, but he really discussed it before Gibson did. In True Names, he really created the whole idea of a cyberspace, which is remarkably prescient. Now we have these virtual worlds being built, which are much like he described. Right now they're mostly text-based rather than video, but that's beginning to change already. Vinge also introduced another idea, which is very popular among a lot of the cyber culture, which is the idea of the technological singularity. An idea that with artificial intelligence coming along and nanotechnology, the processing power and the ability to manipulate physical reality, that we will accelerate our change. We're going through a change like this, and it's going to take off to practically a vertical lift. So we'll be changing so much that in 1 year, the amount of change will be more than at any time the whole of human history.
That sounds a little bit like Terence McKenna and the people who proclaim that towards the year 2012 there will be major shift.
It is something like that. I think McKenna's view is a bit more of a mystical one. He doesn't seem to talk about technology driving this change. It's some kind of mysterious object glittering in hyperspace, as he likes to say. I don't know what the heck that means. The technological singularity makes more sense, although I tend to think it's a little bit overblown. It has... reminds me a little bit uncomfortably of the Christian rapture, where suddenly on one day the saved people will be taken up to heaven. And I think it's going to be a much more gradual transition than that. I think we'll see a great acceleration, but because we'll be going faster, we won't really notice that radical change. It'll seem just normal to us. Just like now, the amount of change we have in 1 year would stagger somebody from the year 1500, but we tend to think, oh, that's normal. You know, we have these new generations of internet software and computer stuff going on, biotechnology, but that's normal for us.
Yeah, but isn't this change thinking, and you're really making it very clear that there is change in the air and you see it in many directions. But now take the internet. Will Joe Sixpack, the couch potato, will he embrace all that technology?
Well, that's very hard to say. But part of the problem is I think the educational system, which certainly in this country and I think other countries, is not geared towards making people very good at independent thinking, that they're made to learn certain facts and regurgitate them. I think if education could be improved so that people could think more independently, they'll better learn these new technologies and make good use of them.
Yeah, but for instance, the internet, does that make people think new thoughts, or does it just make them seek what they already know? Because that seems to be part of the problem. You only look on the web for the stuff you already know. You know about Playboy, so you're going to look for it. You know about NASA, and you hardly look for the surprising, for the synchronicity that could happen.
I think there's nothing that guarantees the internet will make people think creative thoughts. They will tend to look for things that are familiar to them. They'll look at the big newspapers online and so on. There are some interesting new developments, like this active desktop idea that Microsoft is developing, where you'll get content delivered to your desktop, which might include some things that might surprise you. But on the other hand, unfortunately, a lot of people are probably going to say, well, just deliver this kind of news and this kind of news and don't give me anything I'm not interested in. So it may keep them just as narrow as they are right now. So
yeah, but that's the paradigm shift that's happening on the internet. Instead of seeking now, it's called desktop pushing, but basically it means you're going to get what someone else decides for you.
Not really what someone else decides for you. Really, you'll give certain preferences that you have, and then it'll decide what kind of information, what kind of news or services you would like. So it'll be sort of decided by someone else, but increasingly I think it won't be done by human beings. It will be done by software. For instance, there's the Firefly system where you can tell it your preferences in music or whatever it is, and it will look at other people's preferences rather than one central person saying this is what you want to see. It'll look at other people's interests and find things similar to yours. So it may suggest a new book you've never heard of, but which you're likely to find interesting, or a new movie. Mm-hmm. So increasingly, I don't think it'll be humans who decide what we see. It'll be software based on our own personal preferences, and also these active agents will send out there to gather information.
If I look at Extropy and compare it to, say, the psychedelic movement, who is more internal, looking at internal processes, not physical processes. How do you see that?
Well, I think we look at both physical and internal processes because to me they're the same thing. Our brain is a physical process and that generates consciousness in my view. I don't believe there's a separate soul or thinking other than the brain. So extropians, a number of us are very interested in changing the brain through neurochemistry, various kinds of intelligent drugs, smart drugs, some even by psychedelics, but more advanced means preferably to change both our level of intelligence, our ability to concentrate, but also to modify our moods. Right now we have very crude chemicals like Prozac, which are very crude. They change a lot of receptors in the brain. But in the next couple of decades, we're going to see some very finely tuned drugs that will allow you to choose exactly what kind of mood you want to be in. Like right now, do you want to be very focused and very intelligent and able and be creative? Maybe tonight you want to be more romantic and relaxed and not so analytical. I think we'll be able to very, very finely tune how we feel and think in the future. It won't be at the mercy of nature anymore. We'll choose that for ourselves.
But again, there's a danger there that we only will seek the ones we like and not experience maybe the anger or the frustration that also is necessary to help us break new frontiers, for instance.
I think that is a danger. It's going to require some education to make most sensible choices. And one danger is that we'll see a growing division between people where people who are already pretty wise and intelligent will use these technologies to become even smarter and more intelligent and more able and happier. And those people who are not very bright or screwed up will use them to, just like they use drugs right now, to basically make themselves more stupid, more narrow, less creative. So that is a danger in these things, and I'm not sure there's any real way of preventing that. What we can do is try to educate people in the best ways to use these technologies.
Yeah, but don't you see that, for instance, media over the past whatever time have tended to become numbing media, like, you know, we watch television, what's on television, and the net tends to become the same. It's more of the same. So for the average user, the average person, they're not really liberating media, are they?
Well, I think generally the media have got better over time. There's so much garbage on TV that I personally watch very little of it. But there are some quality shows. If you get the more select channels, you can get some good science shows, some good information. Plus, there's really nothing wrong with the occasional soap opera if you want to relax a little bit. But the internet, I think, is offering new opportunities for discovering the useful information you want much more effectively. But it's true, there's no guarantee that people will use that sensibly. Some people, like our cat, will just be looking for new forms of cat food and pictures of mice, and they won't really think beyond their current domains. But it does at least allow people and encourage people, I think, to go exploring. You can click around. It's not like a newspaper where you're stuck with a sheet. You can actually click around and explore new areas and find surprising connections. So it will tend to make people a little more active, I think. But a lot of people want to be passive. There's no guarantee of activity.
It seems that you are thinking, and what the stuff you describe in your magazine, which is not as mainstream as, for instance, Wired or Mondo was, but that it seems to be the stuff that inspires the movie makers.
I wish it did. Unfortunately, movie makers are mostly interested in disaster and horror, not really in positive visions of what's possible for human beings. I think we're beginning to see a trickle of some of these ideas, at least some of the technologies, if not the values. Nanotechnology, for instance, has appeared in one of Brett Leonard's movies. And I think we haven't really seen anything to do with life extension, though. Isn't that curious? You look at Star Trek, set in the 24th century, for goodness sake, and they still die at the same age that we do. To me, that's completely crazy. That's so unrealistic. They can beam each other across space, disintegrate their atoms, but they can't cure aging. So I think movie makers are not really making much use of extropian thinking right now. It's beginning to appear in novels a lot more. We see Werner Vinge's work. There's Jim Halperin's work like The Truth Machine and The First Immortal. But I'm hoping that will eventually spread to movies once they figure out how to make an exciting plot out of these positive ideas.
Mm-hmm. Talking about books, you have a new book, or you have a book coming out on, what's the title going to be?
It's called The Future of Human Beings, and I'll be exploring some of these radical changes that technology will allow us to make in ourselves, how we can essentially rewire our genetic code, change our brains, and become something more than human, post-human as I like to call it. So that'll be coming out this fall, published by Hardwired, and I hope it's going to really shake people up and get them thinking more radically about future possibilities.
Okay, Max Moore, who has a slightly different view on what technology is going to do for us, an extropian view. Thank you for your...
Thanks, Luke.
Okay.